In this video, I'm going to be talking about episode 10 of Smartphone Isekai, and oh boy, do I have a lot to say about this one. This episode almost broke me, to be honest. It's going to be a long one, so let's not beat around the bush. Toya and crew arrive at a beach where the ruins they're looking for are. The Hydra requests that Toya make a gate for them to fast travel back to Belfast so they can acquire swimsuits to play in the water with, and somehow Toya brings back almost every lore character the story has set up so far with him. It is time for the beach episode. Woe betide. So, the first issue we're immediately running into is the enormous amount of cast bloat occurring within this show. This is cast bloat that would make Ruby blush. A particularly striking scene is when the Duke and the King are racing in the water, and then this guy shows up and trounces them. You remember this guy, right? I don't. It's almost paradoxical, right? The show has an enormous cast and is clearly proud of them, but they maybe have 3 collective personalities between them. I can't even state with confidence whether or not this girl has had any lines of dialogue before this episode. And you've got the Hydra, right? These 4 girls who had slightly different personalities from one another. You have the gentle one, the brash one, the excitable one, and the flirty one who is 12 years old. And so they often get grouped into this amalgamation because they always serve the scene. The scene rarely serves them. This is a scene about them kind of flirting with Toya and wanting to show off swimsuits to him. That is the point of the scene, and so all of them act the same because they're being used for the same function. That's why I call them the Hydra. They so often act as one entity, and it's because despite having a dozen characters here, the author doesn't have a dozen different things for them to do. So the Hydra all kind of morph into one character. These 3 old guys morph into one character, and to top it off, as we've established, they aren't even good characters. We spend a solid 8 minutes or so on character work framed as a series of small skits and interactions between the characters. There are definitely jokes, but as we established in episode 9, they aren't funny. They lean heavily on cliches, stick on jokes well past the point that they're stale, and some of them aren't even jokes. Okay. Take this scene here. It is framed as a comedy scene and is focused around how this one character has big boobs, and every time it's pointed out that Toya is staring at them or the camera shows them off, it's framed as a punchline, but that doesn't count as a joke, right? Structurally, they are trying to evoke the idea of a joke, but there isn't anything humorous happening. It's just leering with extra steps, and the end product is baffling, especially considering how long it lasts. As for the character work itself, it's sometimes a bit better than the rest of the show. There is some interest in expressing how the girls differ in personality, like how Lynn's is a lot less hyper than her sister and Yai, but no, shut up. That doesn't count. The show remembering that the characters have personality traits is not character work, but it's fascinating that they have become such an amalgam that them showing any individuality feels oddly refreshing. No character dynamics are progressed, only reinforced. It's a scene with very little narrative purpose, doing little other than reminding you that these characters all exist and that some of them have boobs. If this was 2 minutes long and you just had a few little things like the old guys racing and the 2 moms lying in the beach chairs under parasols, I don't know, that could have been cute, but this takes up half the episode. And that's not even the worst part, because I haven't talked about the 12-year-old girls yet, and I also haven't talked about the Predator. Herein we reach a topic I find somewhat fascinating about shows like this, and that's its odd use of suspension of disbelief. See, in stories, it's very typical to suspend disbelief about things like physics or even continuity in order for the dramatic structure of the narrative to be maintained, but you don't typically see ethics suspended. Ethics, the moral framework of the story, are a thing that you are usually meant to take seriously because that's where stakes come from. When people die in a show, we understand that death is a bad thing, and so we know how to react. When the villain mistreats someone we have sympathy for, we understand that this is meant to make us root against him. A shared sense of right and wrong between audience and author is core to creating conflict, and so it's not something you can usually afford to suspend your disbelief on, but we do exactly that in this show. Take episode 5. Toya is bringing the girls to the Slime Castle in hopes of erotic slime escapades against their wishes. He is being a sex pest here, acting predatory. He is being a bad dude, but we're kind of supposed to just let it slide in the same way an author might ignore physics so that a cool action sequence can work. The author here is ignoring ethics so that something erotic can happen. Now, when I say that ethics are being ignored, I'm not saying that the author is a bad person for putting characters in this situation, but Toya definitely is a bad person for doing that, and we're not supposed to think about it. We're expected to just compartmentalize it, because later in the same episode, he has romantically charged conversations with all of them, and we are meant to take that seriously. It's reminiscent of 50 Shades of Grey? Okay, so in 50 Shades of Grey, Christian Grey is like a terrible person, right? In very obvious ways. He's abusive and controlling and a general asshole, and he has massive serial killer vibes, which is done because, it's meant to be erotic, dominance, submission stuff. But the story has its roots not just in BDSM culture, but also in shipping culture, two things which have more overlap than you think they do. And so the story also wants to show off Christian and Anastasia as a very romantic duo with lots of tender moments, which thematically clash with all of the, other stuff. This is true for 50 Shades, it's true for 365 Days, and lots of other indulgent dark romances, and it's also true for a lot of the porn that the author of this light novel series probably reads. We know he reads maid doujins, and those are rife with very complicated power dynamics that are at once meant to be understood as essentially violating basic human rights, while also being considered wholesome. There is a doublethink necessary for many pornographic fantasies, involving a fluid understanding of ethics and emotional experience that allows for contradiction, in the same way we can look the other way at world building that is somewhat inconsistent. This is a very interesting aspect of erotic writing, a sort of pornographic ethics, and I'm not here to trash the concept outright, but it is one thing to include this kind of odd framing within an erotic novel or trashy dark romance meant for adults. It's another thing to have it within something which is posturing as a lighthearted fantasy action adventure and marketed towards teenagers. Like, let's be clear here. There is no genitalia displayed to the audience, no one goes full frontal, and it doesn't even go as far as having fade to black moments, but Smartphone Isekai is pretty hardcore when it comes to how it presents and discusses the sexual components to its story. It handles themes and ethics in the same way that a really dark hentai does. Take the 12-year-old girls. There is a scene where two of them, in swimsuits, are talking about how they're excited to build sand castles, and a scene clearly meant to infantilize them, furthered by how Toya gives one of them head pats, but in the same exact scene, the same exact exchange, one of those little girls expresses her desire to marry Toya, the self-insert, a detail which serves little narrative purpose besides assumedly wish fulfillment. It is, in terms of how the audience is meant to interpret and process it, very edgy and controversial in how it handles adult topics. And then take, for another example, Lean, the Predator. In this beach episode, she sexually harasses her subordinate purely for her own entertainment, and by her entertainment, I mean our entertainment. This archetype is pretty common in harem stories. She's meant to be the based one, the one who in-universe seeks to create situations meant to be titillating to us, because in-universe, they also excite her, but what the author thinks will be titillating to us is assault, because it's meant to be erotic. We aren't meant to really take it seriously. We're meant to compartmentalize it when it happens, and so it's this weird thing where we're kind of expected to pretend that she's a good person. There are two issues with this. First is that when you go to watch a video on the hub, there's a contract that you sign. Not literally unless you live in Texas, but in your mind, you kind of understand where the content you're looking at lies, where it should be stored in your head. There is an understanding that what you're looking at isn't meant to be a reflection of values. It's wank material. Smartphone Isekai, though, purports to be a genuine story that tries to have genuine emotions, and which just has some fun eroticism on the side, and so it kind of runs into the issue of having a bad message. The show is telling you that these are good people. If you are to buy into the story, then you have to take a look at Toya and not hate him. You have to look at Lean and see just another member of the girl squad, because otherwise, the story doesn't work. There are people who find this comforting, and I understand why. There are comfy elements to this show, but you really need to compartmentalize some stuff. All of this would be fine in, like, something aimed at adults, but anime like this are marketed towards young teenage boys and up, and let me tell you, I genuinely believe it would be more responsible to let a 13-year-old watch hardcore porn than this schlop. And the other issue is that, morality of its existence aside, it makes the show less engaging. How can I root for these people when they so clearly suck? I'm still kind of upset with Toya for episode 5, and I recorded that video like half a year ago. I am not a fan of this guy, and that's just sort of what happens when you put eroticism above your story's own themes and moral compass. One of the few things that this story did right early on is making it so that Toya was, like, heroic in a classical, albeit generic sense. There were reasons to root for him. He was marginally likable, and that gave you the slightest thing to cling on to, but by this point, all of that has completely evaporated. He himself doesn't do too much wrong in terms of his own agency in this episode. He doesn't, like, harass anyone. But this is very much an episode meant to set up the harem fantasy. A harem fantasy involving and attributed to him, and which involves some uncomfortably young individuals, his many previous victims, people who literally work for him as maids, and a psychopath that he enables. And, like, I know that this isn't the point, but the fan service here isn't even good. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of fan service. I tend to prefer my sexual content to exist off in its own corner, but there are lots of people who do like this stuff, and that's perfectly fine. Removing all other context specific to this show, there's nothing morally wrong with making or enjoying a corny, trashy beach episode, and so, look, I know I'm not really the one to give a proper opinion on this, it's not really my thing, but oh my god, this stuff is so weak. The girls just are in swimsuits. No erotic hijinks unfold. He doesn't lather anyone in sunscreen, he doesn't land in anyone's boobs, he doesn't sit on a beach towel incredibly close to one of the girls who then starts cuddling up to him, or anything that's actually, evocative or intimate or human. Just planks of wood staring at each other and drifting in the waves. It's actually a little maddening. Leaving the 12-year-old out of this, the Hydra are in, like, something of a healthy dynamic with Toya by this show's standards. Sure, the relationship with him is really sexist, and they force their expectations on him just because he's the man, and they are not managing the soon-to-be polycule with any sense of grace, but, like, when he stares at their boobs, you at least know that they're fine with it. They like him, there is consent and affection. And this is where the story decides to start pumping the brakes and acting with restraint. When it comes to the 1,000-year-old fairy queen assaulting someone she met that day, oh yeah, super gratuitous. They shoot for the moon. 20 whole seconds of uninterrupted schlop. But when two people actually like each other, suddenly the story lacks any ambition. It's an unwillingness to sexualize women that kind of wraps back around to its own kind of misogyny. They exist solely to be set dressing. After the kind of cute scene where it's shown they want Toya to think they look nice in their bikinis, they are just on display. These characters are, like, supposed to be symbols of desire, and the author can't even think of anything for them to do that is desirable other than exist with their boobs out or molest each other. And all of that just makes how this episode ends more insulting. Toya goes to those ruins he was looking for and finds a teleporter, taking him to a mysterious location called the Aerial Garden of Babylon, a really interesting historical motif that I started out really curious as to where it was going. But then, they made a joke about how the robot, oh, yeah, I suppose this is where the robots come in, about how the robot isn't wearing any underwear, undercutting the genuine atmosphere of intrigue the show barely managed to cobble together. It's truly frustrating. The fan service is weak, spread thin over the entire show, and takes up all the oxygen in the room, as ever-present as it is underwhelming, as insubstantial as it is obtrusive. I was genuinely shocked how little time was even spent inside the ruins. It's like the story forgot what it was supposed to be about. It's a power fantasy, right? You'd think that Toya would have some traps to dodge, or monsters to beat, or a puzzle to solve, some way of asserting his will onto the world around him, and that's kind of where you run into another pretty big problem here in the world of bad isekais. It's a bit of a paradox. Power fantasies are about power, and power is a mean of exerting one's will on the world around you. But to exert will, you need to have will. To enact intentions, you need to have intentions. And that just doesn't describe Toya. Toya's too inert, too nondescript. Beyond just being a self-insert, the narrative doesn't even provide enough wind for his sails to catch. It can be genuinely hard to even remember why these ruins are important. I'm pretty sure it's because Lean thinks they might might have the secret behind the crystal monsters, of which we've seen one in episode 3. It's a very fascinating effect of the cast bloat. There is so much focus on the extended cast that not enough exists for the character this story is supposed to be making seem like the coolest guy in the world. It makes for an interesting point of comparison with shows like Skeleton Knight in Another World. The author was more than capable of creating somewhat compelling and likable characters, it's just that all of them had to play second fiddle to a terrible protagonist who was terrible because the genre demanded that he be overindulgent and a self-insert. He was the worst part of his own story, but Smartphone Isekai is perfectly fine focusing on people other than Toya. However, in this show, every character is bad. I suppose there is some stuff done with the power fantasy, and it is the best part of the episode. Still bad, but it has some life behind it. Toya makes a contract with a new magical beast, who says he must survive enough time in combat with it in order to prove his worthiness. He then combines null magic in such a way to create a situation where the slip spell continuously auto-activates every time his enemy gets back up, which is cool. That's clever. Toya has every null magic, so him combining them is a good use of what makes him unique in the setting. The problem is that this enemy is bending to the solution that the author came up with. This is a legendary creature, and we are to assume it can't deal with being unable to maintain traction on its feet, that it has no other recourse in this situation. It's pure nonsense. There is no sense that Toya has acquired an incredible amount of power, only that his enemy is kind of weak and not worth worrying about. The obstacles he's fighting are close to non-existent, his goals nebulous, and his power barely accentuated. The story unable to even muster passion for the things it refuses to stop focusing on. So it kind of makes me ask the question, why are we even here? To answer that question, I am going to continue checking out this anime along with many other anime. I am currently working on a lot of much larger projects that are going to be multi-hour videos, and I intend to post those in snippets on Patreon as I get bits of them done. So if you want to support me and you want to check those out early, make sure to subscribe to my Patreon. The link is in the description. Also, like and leave a comment. It helps with the algorithm a ton, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, a huge thank you to my patrons, especially my Tier 2 patrons, Bellman, Carolyn Vig, and Love Your Content. Thank you guys so much for your continued support.